Hello and welcome to this video in which I'm building the special hobby Gloster Meteor prone pilot research vehicle in 1/72 scale. If you enjoy the video and find it useful, please remember to like it below, and while you're there you can also subscribe to my channel to see my other builds and projects as they're completed. The Prone Meteor was a one-off research aircraft modified from the last Meteor F.8 fighter out of the factory, adding a forward cockpit in which the pilot lay face down. The idea was that a pilot would be less affected by G-forces in turns laying down, and would also allow less drag in the airframe design. You know, my dad flew once on this plane as human ballast in the front end whilst he was in the services, so I've got a bit of a personal connection to this kit. Let's get on and see what's in the box. The box art is bright and evocative of sunny days test flying in the 1950s, which is ideal, really. Inside, the first thing we get is the instruction sheet. Now, as usual with Special Hobby, this is in full colour, well detailed and pretty easy to follow as well. Next we have the decal sheet. As this plane is a one-off, there is of course only one option. There are a useful number of stencils which bring that edge of detail to a plane that will be painted all over aluminium. Next we have the parts on their sprues. So with these two here you can make a model of a Meteor F.8 fighter, plus the transparencies for the canopy of course. Then essentially what we add to this is a conversion kit included with the box. Now this sprue contains all the parts required for the prone pilot nose section, and there are extra transparencies as well. This extra sprue has the restyled nose with cockpit parts and a replacement tail. Now with the longer nose on the plane, a longer tail section from a Meteor NF11 was used to give the fin and tail plane more authority. The additional transparencies are the hood for the canopy and a small viewing window for under the nose. So those are the parts, let's get on with making the kit. Now I'm going to diverge from the instructions by making the whole nose section first. After washing and priming the plastic, the first thing I'm going to do is mark up the extra sprue with the part numbers. These are missing in the moulding. There is a reference chart in the instructions, but I think it's easier to actually draw them onto the sprue as well. Next I'm going to use this IDF green to pre-paint the pilot's couch. It's a good match for the RAF interior green of the day. The cockpit floor gets painted black, as does the cockpit wall. Now I've also pre-painted the instrument panel in black, then given it a bit of a dry brush with white to pick out some detail. Starting to build now, and I'm adding the pilot's couch to the cockpit floor. It sits at this kind of angle. Next up there are these two shoulder stops, one on either side of the couch. These are very fiddly pieces for my chunky fingers, so out with the tweezers. Next I'm adding the rudder pedals, and these sit on the rear bulkhead of the prone cockpit, and this bulkhead can then be joined to the cockpit floor. Now while that's setting up, I'll build the normal pilot seat for the main cockpit. The back gets glued to the seat first, then the upper body panel is added. The whole thing is painted black. I'm going to prepare the main fuselage parts now. The first thing to do is to cut off the existing nose cone. This is done immediately in front of the gun ports on either side. I'm using a saw from Photo Etch for this. The existing tail needs to be cut off as well. Just use the panel line that's just in front of the fin. One thing the instructions forget to tell you to do is to sand off the gun ports. On the real aircraft the guns were removed and these ports were panelled over. Onto the main cockpit structure, and here the rudder troughs are going to get glued to the floor. Next there's a small divider in the centre and then I'll add the rear wall and let the whole thing set up. While that's drying, I can go back to the prone cockpit, and there's this tiny control stick to add, definitely a tweezer's job. Next I'll put in the prone instrument panel, followed by the rest of the cockpit structure. With all of those in place, I'll add the other half of the front fuselage, clamp it all up and let it dry. A small job whilst that's setting up is to make some straps for the pilot's ejection seat. For this I use strips of masking tape. They sit very easily in place. I'll add some more lap straps, then paint them all in a linen colour with silver buckles. Now I'm fitting the main cockpit structure into the fuselage. Before, I add this part at the back behind the pilot's seat. I find it easier to do this way round. Then there is a side panel for the cockpit. Again, it's easier to fit with the floor already in place in the fuselage. The next tweezer job is the control column that drops into place. Now the hole for this is not all that deep, so keep an eye out in case the stick falls over. I'll give it a red button on top later on. The other side panel needs to go in now, but don't worry, you can adjust the fine positioning later when the other half of the fuselage is in place. The instrument cluster gets glued to the front coaming before going into the fuselage. Again, I wonder if this is done better when the fuselage halves are already been put together, but this is what the instructions say to do. Anyway, the fuselage halves can now go together. Clamp them up to set fully. Now the big moment, fitting the front fuselage. Now by making both fuselage parts ahead of time, I think it's easier to ensure a good fit with a bit of sanding. Once the new nose is on, I'll use a clamp to hold the fuselage upright while it all sets. While I leave all that to its own devices, I'll start on the wings. So here I'm prepping the front end of the engine with black and the front of the air splitter in aluminium. I'll also paint the insides of the intakes in more aluminium. Now I'm going to dry brush some detail onto the engine disc in silver and then add a few bits of brass. I'll use weathering powder later to make it all look sharp. Next to the turbine blades, these get placed into the end of the exhaust pipe. An exhaust ring is placed on the outer end of the pipe. Next I'll glue the splitter across the middle of the engine disc. While those are drying, I'll fit the undercarriage bays into the upper half of the wing. These are located with small pegs. Then I can fit the engine discs into the lower wing inside the inlets. You need to drill some holes in the wing for the exterior fuel tanks. I'm using a 0.8mm drill bit. And with both engine discs and both undercarriage bays in place, the wings can now go together. Add an inlet ring to each engine and add the exhaust pipe to each as well. Clamp up the wing and let it set. Another thing to do now is to make the new fin. It comes as two halves. Simply glue them together, maybe clamp it just to make sure it stays in place. And while that fin's drying, I'll paint the tyres. I use tyre black for the rubber and steel for the wheel rims. With the new tail dry, it can be set in place on the fuselage. Again, by pre-building, I think it makes it easier to fit with the fuselage. The next job is a big one, fit the wings to the fuselage. Now I've found it just slots into place and it fits really quite well. Again, fiddly jobs whilst the large parts are setting. Here I'm making the external fuel tanks. These come in two halves and will need some sanding to smooth out the joints later. Back to the tail now, and I'm going to fit the tail planes, or the horizontal stabilisers. They simply slot in and sit flat on the horizontal. On now to the transparencies, and the first of these is the viewing window under the nose. I've masked it using a bit of offcut of kabuki tape from a mask set from something else, but you can just use normal masking tape. Next is the forward canopy. Now I've masked the edges of the main glass in tape and the forward panels fully with masking tape. Back to the main cockpit, and I'll put the ejection seat in at this point. Then the canopy can go on top. As usual, I'm sealing the canopies with a bit of PVA glue. The canopy's been masked in the same way as the front. And when these are set in place, I'll cover the large parts of the canopy with masking fluid right up to and over the edging tapes. When the canopies are dry, I'll give the kit a coat of polished aluminium spray from a can. Now I can get on with the undercarriage. The first thing to do on the main gear is to set this arm on the main leg. It goes on at quite a steep angle. With the main legs dried, I can then clip the main wheels into place. A tiny dab of glue secures them. There is a similar suspension arm for the nose gear. This sits at about 90 degrees to the hinge. Both main gear and nose gear have these wheel guards fitted, and they are quite fiddly. With the paint dry and the undercarriage setting up, I can start on the decals. Do the wing serials before you attach the fuel tanks. There are a few of these panel line markers around the engines to place. They take a little bit of work to get in place, especially where they have to cover this bulge on the upper surface. But the decals are thin enough to take the contour well without any creasing. With all the decals set, I'll add some weathering to the panel lines to bring them out a bit. Once the undercarriage legs are set, I can start fitting them to the body. They look really low and not nearly long enough, but they are fine. The actuator strut that you fit makes the legs sit very rigidly. Then I can add the undercarriage doors. They simply sit upright from the wing. Likewise at the nose, the leg slots in and the doors go on next to it. Then a few final touches, including this antenna on the back, painting the exhaust as well, remove the canopy masks, and we are done. If you've never done modifications like this before, it can look a bit daunting, but this kit's a good introduction to the skills and well worth it for the experience. The real aircraft is at the RAF Museum at Cosford in the Midlands, in case you're ever over that way. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found the tips useful. Now if you have, then please like the video below, and why not also subscribe to my channel to see my other builds. You can even buy me a coffee if you like. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time.